Yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for joining us here at INC Live for the UFC 263 preview show. My name is Karl Bainbridge and I am joined this month by Luke Alexander. Luke, thank you once again for joining us on short notice, and I'm glad your appearance first time around didn't scare you off making a sophomore outing.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Karl. And you're having me back on a really good card as well. So I'm excited to be here and I'm excited to break down these fights.
And we'll discuss this card in a lot more detail coming up over the next hour. We'll discuss all 5 fights on the main card, as well as touching on some of the prelims. We'll also discuss some of these stories that have been happening in the world of MMA and in combat sports in a lot more detail coming up. The first place we need to start, though, is something which is quite close to yourself, which is the fallout from UFC 262. And as somebody who was actually in attendance at Houston that night, I think you're the best person to talk about Charles Oliveira, lightweight champion.
Yeah, man, what an absolute banger of a fight. I mean, we've seen the news on him, about fighter pay and describing kind of his. I thought the thing, I don't know if you got to see it, Karl, but his game plan going into the fight, him talking about how Chandler typically hits the back of the head and he throws those hooks that kind of loop around the back of the head. And so, I went back and actually rewatched the fight. I was there in person, so it was kind of tough to, be able to break it down like in person, but it was interesting. It looked like the shot that did knock Oliveira down in the first round did kind of clip him on the top or the back of the head. And so it was interesting that Oliveira actually had planned for that. But yeah, getting into the fight in particular, I mean, the crowd was absolutely insane. It was about 50-50 Oliveira Chandler as far as the fans going for each one. And I think Oliveira is in a pretty interesting position right now. He's got most likely going to take the winner of Poirier McGregor. I don't see Dariush sneaking in there at any point. And then, you have Gaethje and Chandler just kind of floating around waiting.
Yes, and I just want to bring up that point as well because I did a post-fight recap immediately after watching the event myself, and I got a little bit of blowback when I called Charles Oliveira a paper champion, which, if you are one of those people who was upset, I do apologise. I never meant it in any sort of disrespect to Oliveira. I think that when you look at the wins that Charles has had, when you look at the achievements he's had, he's worthy of being champion. What I was getting at, though, is can you call Charles Oliveira the best lightweight in the world? And personally, I think with Dustin Poirier around, I don't think you can. What he's going to get the opportunity, though, to do is to prove those people wrong. I think that him versus Poirier or McGregor, whoever wins that fight at 264, will face him for the belt. And if he beats that person, there is no argument. But I just think at this moment in time, Dustin Poirier for me is the best lightweight, and that's all I was getting. So that's just my own little disclaimer in regards to Charles Oliveira.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. And I mean, you get that sometimes. I mean, with a division like lightweight, I mean, it's so tough. I mean, any guy on any given night in the top 5 could take, somebody out. But I do agree with you. I mean, Poirier, beating McGregor, I mean, his fight with Khabib, being, I mean, if you could say fairly competitive, having that win over Gaethje. I mean, he obviously hasn't fought Chandler, but yeah, he's definitely not a paper champion. I mean, he's, came up and his strength of schedule towards the beginning of his career is really strong. He fought everybody, in their prime. And then, the fights that got him to his title shot might not be as strong, but, like the heavy hands guys say, I think he did kind of like a reverse development. And so I think Oliveira, no matter what, is one of the top 5 fighters in the world. But I agree. I think, getting the fight with Poirier will show us, if he is the best lightweight in the world.
And that's a fight that will most likely happen later on in the year, possibly around sort of November, December time, depending on how things open up in the world. Another fight that will be taking place later on this year, it's one that we sort of have to bring up with it being an MMA connection. Tyron Woodley versus Jake Paul.
Yes. So I saw some people tweeting like last night, like a little late, that it was going to get called off, but I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't really know how to feel about this. There's just not enough footage on Jake Paul for me to make a confident, assessment of like his skills. I think he has like a pretty good 1-2, I mean, Askren looked really slow and he still managed to land a lead left hook on, Paul almost immediately in their fight. So, I mean, I'm still leaning towards Woodley. How about you?
I think Tyron's got much better boxing fundamentals than what Jake Paul does, but I never knew Tyron to have a great jab, which I think is a very important thing when it comes to boxing. So I think I hate to say it, you've got to lean towards A, the bigger guy, and B, the guy who has better boxing fundamentals. Like Jake Paul is training to be a boxer. Tyron Woodley had boxing as part of an MMA portfolio. I think the bigger concern for me is this is not an isolated incident. We are seeing a lot of fighters who are taking up these boxing matches. You had Ben Askren earlier in the year. Frank Mir had a fight on that Triller card. Anderson Silva's going to be fighting, I think, Chavez Jr. What do you think it is that's causing so many of these sort of veteran names to just take this quick payday and maybe sacrifice some of their legacy for a boxing match?
I think you said it yourself. I mean, I think it's the payday. I mean, you get in there, you're going to make maybe twice as much as you would, fighting on an undercard as you did previously in your career. You do some media. You don't have to do as much media. I mean, I guarantee you Frank Mir maybe did like 2 hours, an hour worth of media that entire Triller card. I don't know exactly what Frank Mir's disclosed payout was. It eludes me now. I remember seeing it, but I mean, it was pretty good for him just fighting Steve Cunningham on the mid card. I mean, he didn't look that bad, but yeah, I think it's pay. I think that you can go in there, you can fight against a guy, you can build your name up and your brand or whatever you might have going on. There's so many more people that know Ben Askren now than they did before. I mean, now that he's fought Jake Paul, he's a pretty known commodity. He has other businesses, So if you're a guy who's out and you're, a Woodley and Anderson Silva and you're sitting on the sidelines, would you want to lace him back up and go fight a top 25, top 15 guy in the UFC and barely get paid anything to possibly risk, further injury? Or would you rather go fight a YouTuber, a streamer, where you're still facing injury, but you're getting a lot more press with a different crowd than you ever had before and way more money?
I think Vitor's going to be taking a boxing match as well.
Should be interesting. I thought it was so weird with Vitor sidebarring that, he got signed to one. He never fought in one, did he? He just was released.
Yeah. So 10 billion people around the world are going to be disappointed with that one.
Yeah.
We're going off on tangents here. We need to be talking about UFC 263. It's going to be taking place in Glendale, Arizona. Ironically, the same place that the first Adesanya versus Vettori fight that took place, same location. So I think that's an interesting cycle. Before we get to that fight, though, we're going to be talking about the prelims. And I have to say, as the UFC have done for all of these post-pandemic cards with the crowds, I think we've got ourselves a stacked prelims. You can see them on the screen right now. Are there any fights in particular for you which stand out?
I would say on the early prelims, you have Frank Camacho versus Matt Frevola. And I mean, this is just matchmaking at its finest, I would say. I think that this is going to be an absolute firefight. I'm leaning Frevola, but yeah, I think that both guys have a pretty similar style. They both have pretty decent chins, and I think that this is a good fight to see where each of them are in the lightweight division. I'm pretty high on Frevola. I think if he could get his brawling tendencies down a little bit, I think he has, some good solid wrestling when he needs it. And I think his boxing is pretty good.
I'm interested in that fight as well. I personally love Frank Camacho as well. I know that the brawling side of things is something that he does have a lot of difficulty trying to get out of his system, but a ton of heart. I love that fight he had with Luis Pena, which I really got much more invested in that fight than I maybe should have done. In terms of myself, I think on the whole, I think the prelim fights have a lot of potential. I think Evelev versus Dawodu. If you're looking for the next featherweight prospect, it could very well come from that fight. Striker versus grappler matchup, so you've got that to play into. Dawodu, he maybe doesn't sit down on his shots as much as what I would like, but fantastic kickboxing. Evelev, great grappler, as you'd expect from anybody from Dagestan. Drew Dober versus Brad Vidal as well. I like this matchmaking. I think Brad Vidal has looked very good in his first few matches in the UFC. And this is his first real chance to see how good he truly is. You get through Drew Dober, you're worthy of being in that sort of rankings discussion.
Right. No, I agree. I mean, I'm really excited. I mean, this feels like smarter matchmaking by the UFC, even than on 262. I mean, you give Drew Dober versus Brad Riddell is fireworks. You get the good striker versus striker lightweight matchup that you want to see. I think each guy has like an interesting. They have interesting kickboxing games, that are pretty similar but slightly different. So I'm pretty interested to see, how Dover does against a guy that is just a really, really good pure striker. Yeah, Evelev Dawadu's going to be absolutely amazing. Dawadu was a guy who initially I wasn't very high on, but his last win against Zubaria Tukov, that's not a win to knock off. I mean, Zubaria is a legitimate fighter, so yeah, I'm interested to see if he can take this one against Evelev and continue his run. Also, I mean, Joanne Calderwood versus Lauren Murphy. It's an interesting fight. I mean, Joanne's last fight, she was a buzzsaw and just put on a great counter performance. So I'm interested to see if she could knock Lauren Murphy off and continue her ascent to the women's flyweight title.
Do you think the UFC have made the right call putting that fight so far down the card? Because it's 90% sure the winner of this fight's going to face Shevchenko next. And the UFC, they've been criticised in the past for not marketing their lower profile weight classes. And you just sort of think, how are you supposed to get people excited for a Shevchenko title fight when you're hiding the person who she's going to be fighting next?
I do agree. It's funny you say that. Actually, before I saw this, I was wondering, I was like, they could easily be switched out with Paul Craig, Jamal Hill. But I mean, I understand they're trying to get Hill a little bit more pop as well, as the new light heavyweight contender. But yeah, it's tough to say. I mean, I feel like the main card is very stacked and it has a bunch of good fights placed where they need to be. I couldn't see them being the feature prelim as well. So yeah, I just think that, there's so many good fights and there's so many interesting matchups on this card. They kind of just slotted in where they did. But I do agree. I think that, they do need some more exposure for a number one contender fight. It definitely shouldn't be, 8 fights down the card. But I think that's just the way that this card shaked out due to how stacked it is.
Like, we had the card just yesterday, the Rosenstrike versus Sakai card. I personally would have been okay with Murphy versus Calderwood as like the co-main for that.
Yeah, no, I could have definitely seen that. Maybe one less heavyweight fight and then throw them on that. So yeah, might not have worked out. But I mean, Bilal Muhammad versus Damian Maia could be, switched. I don't know. It's tough to say. I mean, I agree. They definitely need someone. They definitely need some more spotlight on the women's flyweight division. So this, when they do announce the next Valentina Shevchenko title fight, people aren't like, who? So.
Well, that's a discussion for another time. Obviously, Shevchenko will probably make another defense of her belt around sort of September, October time. But now, though, we're going to be talking about the first fight on the card. You touched on this to an extent, and it's one of my boys in action, Paul Craig, the number 14 light heavyweight. He's taking on man just below him in the rankings, Jamal Hill. Just looking at some of the bookmakers' odds for this fight, Jamal Hill is a big favourite for this one, minus 290 with Bovada. You can get Paul Craig at plus 230. We're starting to see, and I sort of mentioned this before in a couple of the previews, we're starting to see a new generation of light heavyweights coming through. Younger guys who the UFC are quite eager to push to the fore. So a couple of months ago, we had Jimmy Crute. He got what was hoped to be his sort of big breakout match against Anthony Smith. This feels a very similar situation for me with Jamal Hill. I think the UFC is starting to try and get the gears in motion to maybe push him higher up the rankings.
I agree. I mean, his last fight, it was the Ovince St. Preux fight. He stopped Ovince St. Preux. Yeah, it's interesting they gave him Craig, after stopping and beating Ovince St. Preux. But I agree. I think that, they're trying to push Hill as much as they possibly can. I mean, he was a Dana White's Contender Series guy, wasn't he? And then, yeah, they're trying to get him some pop. I know Paul Craig's your boy, so you might agree with me. I don't know why Hill is so much of a favorite over Craig. I mean, Craig can be slow and lumbering on the feet, but I do think he's gotten a little bit better on the feet during his time in the UFC. He survived with Ankalaev to, eventually submit him in round 3. I'm not really high on Hill yet. I think he has a good, pressure striking game. He cut the cage pretty well against Ovince St. Preux and was able to finish him, but I've never seen him really tested on the ground. And so I'm interested to see if Craig can impose his will on him there.
That's the big key for me. Is the one thing we haven't seen from Jamal Hill is a great ground game yet. I've watched a couple of his fights from the regional scene, what he's been doing in the UFC so far, and Darko Stosic managed to get him down 5 times in their fight. But Stosic was almost sort of using those takedowns almost sort of like to try and make an impact with the judges. I don't think he seemed all that interested in actually keeping the fight there. Paul Craig, as we've seen from all these fights, his bread and butter is his grappling, maybe to his own detriment, which we'll maybe get into a little bit further on in this discussion. But if Paul Craig is able to get Jamal Hill down, I'm going to be interested to see what Jamal is able to do, because I've got this fear if Paul Craig can survive that sort of explosive get up, we could see a Jamal Hill who's quite lost.
I agree. I really see that. And I think that there is value on Craig this week. I don't think Jamal Hill has world-ending power. Of all the fights that I've seen, he does have some knockouts, but I mean, he throws really quick, straight shots. He throws with some volume. I don't think he has that much power, so I'm not as worried unless Craig, gets his feet crossed up or, fight just hands down and just runs into something. I really don't see him shutting Craig's lights off early. So I think if Craig can make this a long fight, draw out exchanges, get into the clinch, I think he could get him to the ground. And I agree. I don't think Hill has faced anyone. Craig is legitimately dangerous anywhere he is on the ground. He can get you off his back. He'll easily take your back. And so I'm leaning towards Craig in this one, to be quite honest with you.
I would personally lean towards Jamal Hill. I do love Paul Craig, and as I mentioned before, he's part of my sort of boys stable, as it were. But there are a lot of flaws with Paul Craig. While he has made improvements in his striking, and I think he does have some decent kicks, which I think's a trait of Paul Craig that people don't really talk too much about. If you notice, it's very different when Paul Craig's moving forward when he's striking than he is moving backwards. Because if you notice, when he's moving forward, it's hunched down. He's trying to lure people. Am I going to shoot him for the takedown? But when he's on the back foot, head goes straight up, and that's when he gets caught. So I can see Jamal Hill trying to exploit that. Also, Jamal Hill has a hell of a good kick. Like, he will target those legs. He'll work the body. He did that especially well when he fought OSP and he fought Darko Stosic. So I could see a lot of body kicks from Hill. I am interested to see how Jamal Hill is able to handle, and I hate to bring this up, this is probably going to hurt the algorithm, but he did get COVID. And I was reading up on some stats. Fighters who got COVID and then came back into action, they only have a 40% win ratio in their first fight back in action. So I'm interested to see if that maybe has an impact on Jamal Hill's performance.
Yeah, it's another X factor to put in there. I think the sample size is like pretty small with like who they've tested based on, like their performance. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can see, Jamal can kick. He's got a really, really strong kick, and, taking a win over OSP is it's a legitimate win. OSP is about as much as a gatekeeper at light heavyweight as anyone is. And so, yeah, it's tough. I feel like I'm leaning more towards Craig, because I, too, really, really like him, and I just haven't seen enough of Hill and haven't been as impressed. And, Stosic was able to take him down pretty easily. I don't really remember Craig having that much of an offensive takedown game, but I'll keep my Craig pick. But, yeah, I think this is a great matchup. It's a great way to start off the main card, and, it's going to make for a good weigh-in. Craig is always in guys' faces at the weigh-ins, and he comes painted, so I think it'll be a great fight that I think that'll get the fans interested.
I think that's a great thing about Paul Craig as well, which you touched on there, is he never seems intimidated in any of his fights. And he's faced Shogun Shua, one of the legends of sport, twice. And this is his 5th time that he's faced an unbeaten opponent. It was Tyson Pedro, Jimmy Crute, Alonzo Menefield, Ankalaev, and now Jamal Hill. So he has no issue facing these dangerous guys that the UFC are chucking him into. No,
not at all. I totally even forgot. That's his strength of schedule at light heavyweight. He's not taking an off fight. Those are all, each man has his own problems that he's fought in there. But those are all, you would say bad matchups for him. Obviously he caught Shogun at the tail end of his career, but yeah, it's going to be an interesting fight. I think this is going to be a great fight for us to see where Jamal Hill is at and where he goes from here, with a win or a loss.
And if Paul Craig was to win, we're looking at a guy who's unbeaten in his past 5. So he's going to be entering sort of like Anthony Smith territory.
Right. Yeah. light heavyweight's just such an interesting division, because I mean, a guy like Craig, like you said, I mean, he does have his very apparent flaws where he does back up, with his head pretty straight up on the center line. So, you see him getting closer to the top 10 or top 5, and there's probably guys that would knock him flat out. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, still to this day, his Ankle Live performance has blown me away. That was one of the most insane comeback wins I've ever seen in a fight.
Got the feeling, because I'm very high on Ankalaev. We could honestly get a situation where Ankalaev could win the light heavyweight title, which is not beyond the realm of possibility. He wins the title and Paul Craig sort of becomes his Stefan Struve. That sort of fight that the fight that people keep going to and just saying, yeah, but you lost to this guy.
Yeah, I think that's a very apt comparison. Yeah, I definitely could see that. I'm really high on Ankalaev as well. I think he's, putting together the wins that he needs to put together now. And, by the time he gets up there, I think he's definitely going to be ready to face whoever holds the belt at that time.
Its heavyweight's got so good. So good.
It is. It was bad for a little while, and now it's picked right back up with Jones leaving, I feel like.
Yeah. We'll move on to the welterweight division now. Now, this was interesting matchmaking, I thought. When I was thinking of fights potentially for either of these two guys, I certainly didn't think they would get matched up together. It's Demian Maia taking on Belal Muhammad, number 9 seed taking on the number 12 seed. Now, before we discuss the fight in detail, I want to talk a little bit about Demian Maia himself, because we've got Demian Maia now, who's 43 years old. All indications are this is going to be his final fight in the UFC. He's going to retire afterwards. And I think this is a guy for me who just doesn't get as much appreciation as what he maybe should do, because we've all seen mixed martial arts evolve into a mix of wrestling, jiu-jitsu, striking, kickboxing, all those sort of fields. And yet, here's this guy who essentially is a relic in terms of the way he fights. And yet he's been able to fight for a UFC title twice. Everyone who's beaten him has either been a champion or fought for a title. I wouldn't call him a legend, maybe that's maybe a bit too extreme, but he's certainly one of those guys who, in my opinion, deserves a lot more appreciation than what he gets.
I 100% agree. I mean, I think I'd go ahead and call him a legend. I think that, his ability to bring and keep his game so consistent throughout has just made him, so much fun to watch. I mean, it's not 3 years ago that, he got beat by Colby Covington, but he pulled a competitive fight. He was beating Colby up at times on the feet, and we know how good Colby is now. And that was kind of Colby's coming out party, as well as Usman's, like you said, if you beat Maia, people knew you were legit. He's been sort of a high level gatekeeper towards the tail end of his career, but he pulls hard fights out of guys. Hard fight with Jorge Masvidal as he was coming up, and then it's every time. If you're not elite and you're not ready to be at that level, he's going to get you out of there quick. Quick submission of Lyman Good, quick submissions against other people, more recently. But yeah, I think that this is a great fight to see, to send him off. And I'm very surprised that Belal is a minus 265 favorite. I thought it would be a little bit more even, but I guess the odds makers are just really seeing Maia's age as a factor.
I think that's the biggest factor for me as well. 43 years old is in an elite division like welterweight is a very hard ask. I also think as well activity, because Demian Maia last fought in, I believe, March 2020. I think he was on that Brasilia card where he had to close off the crowd. Whereas with Belal, we're talking about a guy who just fought in the spring. So right. I think maybe activity is a big factor as well.
I agree. Yeah, I'm interested to see what we get with Maia, when he does come into this fight. As far as analysis on this fight, Muhammad has just been looking better and better with each fight. I was so sad that the fight against Edwards ended in a no contest. Edwards was getting the better of the exchanges early, but I was interested to see if Muhammad was going to find his way back in there. I think Muhammad's boxing has been just getting better as he's gone on. So I don't know if Belal Muhammad gets taken down. I think it's when. I'm interested. I think Maia can get Muhammad down is what I'm trying to say. What about you?
Well, I've always known Belal to struggle with body lock takedowns. I think that's one of the big weaknesses. And as you know, that's where Demian Maia's bread and butter is. I think Belal's going to be the faster fighter when it comes to the feet. Obviously, Demian isn't comfortable with his striking. And I also think Belal's going to have a big advantage when it comes to the length of the fight. If it does go into the second and third rounds, we've seen Damian Maia gas quite badly in some of his fights. Even the Lyman Good, not Lyman Good, I think it was, oh, what's her name? Kayla Harrison's ex, Rocco Martin. In the
Rocco Martin.
In the Rocco Martin fight, he gasped badly in that third round. So if it does go into the third, we know that Bilal has a great conditioning. So I'd be interested to see if maybe that plays into a factor. I don't see Bilal being able to finish Damian. I don't think Bilal has that great finisher instinct. If he does have it, it's more in terms of his grappling, and you're never going to want to grapple with Damian Maia. So I think it's going to come down to that second round. It's going to come down to how Bilal handles the initial Damian Maia shot in the third round, in the first round, I should say, and then the second round. If he gets the upper hand in the second round, I can see him winning the third as well.
I agree. I think that's basically my analysis as well. I think it's handling the first shot. You know, I mean, Lyman Good wasn't able to handle that first shot. You know, Askren, obviously their fight, you know, they were pretty evenly matched as far as wrestling goes, and you know, he eventually submitted him. I think Muhammad will be able to, like you said, he does have the weakness of body lock takedowns. I think he's going to be able to stay behind his jab, cut the ring pretty well, and then just feint as much as he possibly can to draw out shots. You know, and hopefully make Maia, you know, miss on a couple of those shots. I think that Muhammad will be the better conditioned. I mean, he's never really had conditioning issues. I mean, if anything, he's almost has the Ferguson factor. He gets beat up a little bit initially, and then he comes back strong 2 and 3. So yeah, I could see where age and conditioning really could be the factor of this fight on Muhammad's side.
And I'm glad that Bilal as well is getting this opportunity, this sort of showcase position, because he almost sort of looked into the Leon Edwards fight, because that was going to be, I think, Chimaev initially. He stepped in on short notice, which I think caught a lot of people by surprise. They didn't really know who he was. That fight ended the way it did. So I'm glad the UFC is saying, we're sorry for what happened. In return, you're going to be fighting this great MMA name from years gone by in a pay-per-view. So I'm glad the UFC have done that for him. So like a company man gets his reward.
I agree. Yeah, and I think this, like we said, I mean, Maia is not a favorable matchup for anyone. I mean, you know, anybody, he can body lock you and take you down. But I mean, this is a massive win for Muhammad to have on his record. You know, Maia still carries name, has name recognition. I mean, he's still ranked number 9. So this is a great shot for Muhammad to jump into the top 10.
Do you think Bilal makes the most of this opportunity? Does he get it done?
I'm leaning towards Bilal. I think that depending on what type of Maia we see, I could see Muhammad. I mean, the way that he was putting his punches together in his past couple fights, I could see him finishing Maia. Maia gets a little bit reckless, you know, if he doesn't land his first shot. You know, I mean, the fight against Burns, I mean, he kind of just walks straight into that. So I could see Muhammad, if he does, he is able to stifle that first shot. I could see a Muhammad finish, and I think for Bilal's sake, a big finish against Maia would really do him a lot. I'm going to lean towards Muhammad. I think he can withstand that first shot, and I think he can go on to win probably a 29-28, if not 30-27 decision.
I'm going to say Bilal by decision, mainly for the same reasons that you brought up as well. Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting fight. It reminds me a lot of Craig versus Hill. All logic says that the lower ranked guy has more traits which are going to be giving him the edge. But Damian Maia and Paul Craig, they are capable of finishing. If you make one wrong move on the ground, they're going to take advantage of that. So it's quite interesting. Sort of like logic versus that sort of finisher, if you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah. And there's, you know, just so many unknowns on Maia's side. It's a tough pick. Like you said, his inactivity, his age, there's a lot of stuff that, you know, make him a tough pick. I mean, they've made him a tough pick for years, and he's still won. So you never know with that guy.
I mean, I was looking through some of the guys that he was beating to get that shot at Tyron Woodley. Like, he was beating like Masvidal, Condit. He went through some absolute killers. So he's more than capable of getting it done, even when the UFC arguably maybe didn't want him to. He's always been a tough out. Always been a tough out.
I mean, you know, the Rocco Martin fight, I mean, that's a young, strong, big guy that, you know, he was able to take 2 rounds against. So, yeah, I mean, this is not an easy softball matchup for Muhammad. I mean, Leon Edwards posed his own problems, but I think this is going to be a good win for Muhammad to have. If he gets this win, I think this shows us stuff about his ability to deal with grapplers. He hasn't fought as many grapplers, in his lineup, and both of his losses have not came against really strong grapplers. So I think this is a good fight, like we said, to have on his resume. I'm going to continue going with Bilal Muhammad.
Good thing you mentioned Leon Edwards as well, because, coincidence, it's time for us to talk about the welterweight 5-round non-title match between Leon Edwards and Nate Diaz, returning for the first time since UFC 244. Strange matchmaking from the UFC initially, but the more I've thought about it, what a good fight this could be.
I agree. Yeah, straight 5 rounds, third fight. Yeah, there's a lot of strange stuff in it, but yeah, what a great fight that this could be. I mean, Nate's always a fixture. I mean, he's going to bring the most eyes to any card that he's on constantly. I mean, and then Edwards, a guy that just has consistently not gotten his due. I mean, a guy who's been overlooked and underappreciated, I think, his entire tenure in the UFC. Had the anticlimactic end to his Bilal Muhammad fight. So I think that this is I'm a big Leon Edwards fan. So I'm very excited because I think that this is a great win to, catapult him into welterweight contendership where he should be right now.
I think there's a real split, in my opinion, with the fan base when it comes to Leon Edwards. Like, if you listen to the hardcore fans who watch shows like this, most people love the guy. They appreciate some of the intricacies of his work. But when you speak to the average Joe, who maybe picks and chooses what fights he watch, he's an unknown, or he's just that boring Brit who doesn't finish people. So I think this sort of showcase fight, the chance to fight Nate Diaz, who obviously carries with him a massive fan base, a dedicated fan base. If Leon was to get this done, and at the moment he's like a minus 500 to do so, a lot of those casual fans who maybe had been ignoring him will surely have to sit up.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Diaz, I mean, he's had his, fights. I mean, he had that big last McGregor win, I mean, he looked, I guess, fairly competitive against Masvidal, but, he doesn't have fair weather fans. I mean, no matter what, he has ride or die fans. And yeah, I've never understood the Edwards dislike. I think some of the dislike as well came, Masvidal, punching him at that post-fight press conference and stuff like that. I think, like you said, there's just not enough exposure to Edwards. I don't think Edwards has fought on, I mean, I'm not real sure. I can't looking back, but I don't think Edwards has really fought on like the main card of a really highly watched pay-per-view. He fought on some lesser viewed cards. So yeah, I just don't think he's a household name. And so when people do see him, the only time they may have heard of him is Masvidal or someone else talking trash about him, and he had that chance to fight Chimaev before, he had to take that break. So I think this is an even better fight for him than Chimaev, because there wasn't as many people, the hardcore fans knew about him. Some of the casuals knew about him, but this is an easier fight for him stylistically, and everybody knows who Nate Diaz is.
What do you think of the UFC's decision to make this a 5-round fight? Do you think this was maybe a factor that Nate threw in to say, hey, if I'm coming back, it has to be 5 rounds?
100%. So when we talked on our 262 preview show, that was actually you that brought that up, and I could 100% see that. I definitely think that this could be a concession from the UFC for Diaz. Diaz has spoken in the past about, not liking 3-round fights and really preferring 5-round fights. And so, yeah, I could definitely see, when Diaz is negotiating. I mean, the UFC needs Diaz. I mean, they need him in as many fights as possible. I think he gets, thousands, if not tens of thousands of more pay-per-view buys when people see him on that main card. And so it's an easy pick. I mean, I don't know why they don't have more 5-round top contender fights, anyways. So
the one thing I will say, though, on the whole, I like the idea of a 5-round non-title fight. It's something that I've sort of maybe pushed for a while. My issue is the UFC can be very subjective of when they implement this, and that could open them up to favoritism. Because for me, it should either be none or everyone. And then you have a situation where you've got things like Ketlin Vieira versus Yana Kunitskaya, which is 25 minutes.
Right. Yeah. Or the Lauren Murphy, Joanne Calderwood. Yeah. I mean, or, even non-women men fights. I mean, in divisions that just aren't as stacked. Yeah. No, it can get very subjective very fast. I do agree. So, Yeah, it's interesting because I mean they are kind of setting a precedent with this, but they're not. I mean that we really don't have any reasoning why this is 5 rounds. We're both speculating. So yeah, it's interesting if this is a precedent that's set that they're going to start implementing moving forward, or if this was just a one-time concession to Nate Diaz's camp.
Talking about the fight itself, a lot of people call Leon Edwards quite generic, say he's a bit of a boring fighter. I actually think he's very unique. I've never seen a fighter work this well outside the clinch, because if you notice with Leon Edwards and the way he fights, I think the Gunnar Nelson fight is the best example of this. He is fantastic in the clinch, and especially the way he releases from the clinch and uses that to throw elbows and big strikes. And that caused Gunny a lot of problems. It caused RDA a lot of problems. And I think it's going to be a big factor in this fight, considering the way that Nate Diaz fights. He likes to get a bit dirty. He likes to make it a bit of a grindy fight. He tries doing that with Leon Edwards. He's going to be eating a load of elbows.
I agree. I think that I felt that this matchmaking was almost kind of mean, to Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz, when I went back and rewatched some of his fights, he does exit the clinch very lazy. And if there's one thing that you cannot do against Leon Edwards is exit. I mean, he repeatedly punished Gunnar Nelson every time he would exit the clinch with a punch, an elbow. Yeah, Edwards I don't think there's many people that possess the type of game that Edwards has. And so I think people just say it's boring. Also, I think Edwards has beaten some fan favorites. He beat Cowboy, he beat Gunnar Nelson, he beat some people with existing fan bases, and he might not have beat them in the most exciting or compelling way. So I do think that could be where some of the hate is coming from. But I really feel like Edwards is aptly able to take advantage of all of Diaz's weaknesses in his game. Like, I just feel like this is a very forgiving matchup for Leon Edwards.
What do you think are Nate's best traits to win, though? Like, we're sort of painting this as a gimme for Leon Edwards. What do you think Nate has that can cause Leon problems? Because one thing I have noticed is Leon does like to try and slow the pace a lot. He prefers to fight at that more lethargic pace. And yet Nate, great pressure striker. He likes to make people work. We saw that when he fought against Conor. We've seen that throughout his career. Could that maybe be a factor of Nate trying to push the pace and maybe put Leon into a position which he's not comfortable with?
I think it's just that. I think that Nate has to be able to push the pace. He needs to push the pace, but at the same time, get caught by something. In the Masvidal fight, there's delusional fans who think that if the fight wouldn't have been stopped, that Diaz would have pulled away in 4 and 5. I mean, Masvidal seemed just as tired as Nate. Edwards has really, not to my knowledge, ever had any conditioning problems. I've never really seen him, fatigue. I mean, everybody slows naturally, towards the end of their third or fifth round, depending on what fight they're fighting. But yeah, I do think that, Diaz's best chance is just pushing out an all-out firefight against Edwards. I don't think Edwards has just like great power as far as, his 1-2 or his kicks or anything on the feet. But yeah, I do think that like some of his clinch exits and some of the stuff that he throws on that will be the dividing thing that puts him over Nate Diaz.
It should be noted Leon has won his last 2 5-round fights, because he beat RDA and Cowboy. Diaz has lost his last 2 5-round fights against Conor and Masvidal.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I just, for Diaz to get into the fight, I think Edwards is going to have to slow. And I think it's 100% dependent on that. I mean, Edwards looked fine against RDA. And I mean, if there's anybody who can push a pace for 5 rounds, it's RDA. So
all roads seem to be pointing towards Usman fighting Colby again. That's going to be the next fight at welterweight. Does Leon Edwards maybe change the UFC's mind, A, if he wins, and B, if he finishes Nate?
Possibly. I mean, I think that's his best shot. We have Burns, Wonderboy, looking like Colby, Usman. So, yeah, I think that, if Edwards goes out and knocks out Nate Diaz, and then, Wonderboy maybe beats Burns in like a 5-round decision that's similar to like a Darren Till or, one of his Woodley fights, I definitely think the UFC would probably lean towards Leon Edwards.
Because Nate has only ever been finished once in the UFC, and that was against Josh Thompson back in 2013, as well as the Masvidal fight. So Masvidal was a doctor stoppage. Only time he's been knocked out in the UFC was when Josh Thompson head kicked him. So it would be a big coup if Leon Edwards is able to get this finish.
I agree. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we have good matchups all through right now, even if Colby might not as be deserving as what I think or others think. I think the top ranks at welterweight. There's really interesting fights. I don't see Burns getting a title shot if he beats Wonderboy immediately after beating Wonderboy. So yeah, I'd say that either Edwards or Wonderboy would probably have the best chance of the title shot. And then if we got to give him a shot, like if Nate wins, I mean, he's definitely in there somewhere.
Like, the UFC are not going to turn down the chance to put Nate Diaz in a title fight just because of the amount of eyeballs. Like, I was looking at the poll here. I always run a poll asking which fight on the card most people are going to be interested in watching. And Diaz versus Edwards had 40% of the vote. So that's more than both title fights.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can see that. And I honestly see this fight playing out a similar way as Dariush versus Tony. When I went to the Houston card, everybody in the entire crowd was a Tony fan. I see a lot of people who are Nate fans maybe being disappointed and Nate not really getting in this fight. That might not. I love the matchmaking for Edwards in this fight, but I mean, if you have Nate, I don't know if you'd want to throw Nate against another, top 3 guy right off the bat, as we said, coming off of 2 losses. But yeah, I think it's an interesting matchup, and it's going to, at least in my opinion, it's going to give Edwards a pretty good claim to a title shot down the road.
Full main event time now, and we're going down to the UFC Flyweight division, and we're going back to December of last year. UFC 256. Now, Deivison Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno was a short notice title fight. Both of them had fought at 255. A lot of title fights have fallen out over that card, so these two were drafted in together on like 3 weeks' notice to headline against one another. Not many people gave Brandon Moreno a chance in that fight. What followed was arguably one of the best fights of the year. Most polls I'd seen had it at number 2 behind Whaley versus Joanna. It was an amazing fight, and they get to run it back again.
Man, what an absurd fight. I mean, I'd say that was probably my fight of the year. It's so close. I mean, I'd say Whaley versus Joanna was probably tied. I mean, it's flip a coin, whichever one you watch, go back and watch it what certain day. But yeah, what an absolute banger of a fight. I mean, I've always liked Moreno. I just never knew that he was capable of that.
I'm in the same boat. Like, I'd always had Moreno down as, I gave Brandon Moreno more chance in that fight than what other people did. Like, I run the polls on the community tab, asking people for who they thought was going to win the title fight. And Figueiredo was like 91% favourite to win. So, like, more people thought Felicia Spencer was going to win her title fight than Brandon Moreno was going to beat Figueiredo. And yet, Moreno put in this fantastic performance, and I think he won himself a lot of fans with that. The question that stays in my mind, and I think the biggest factor going into this rematch, did the short turnaround hurt Figueiredo more than it did Moreno? And now that he has those extra months to train and to get his conditioning back into focus, because it may have been off with the quick turnaround, are we going to see that same sort of parity in terms of their performance? Is Figueiredo going to go into this fight a lot better than he did back at 256?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest dynamic. I mean, Moreno had an ungodly chin in their last fight, and Figueiredo did gas. I mean, he definitely slowed. He didn't necessarily. I mean, he kept his output pretty consistent, but I don't think there was as much pop. He didn't carry as much power with him into the later rounds as what he typically does. And I think Moreno would have been in trouble if he would have carried his power with him a little bit better, into the later rounds. And so, yeah, I see that being the main dynamic of this fight. I think we could get a better, more well-conditioned Figueiredo, easier weight cut, and he could come in, carry his power a little bit later. And, both guys landed, but I mean, I think Figueiredo was landing the most in the early rounds.
That's the big thing with Figueiredo is a massive flyweight. Like, he's even spoken before. He says that flyweight is only really a short-term thing. I could very well be going to bantamweight further down the road. Hits like an absolute truck as well. Definitely the hardest hitting 125er on the roster. Great guillotine. We've seen that effectively when he fought Alex Perez, Tim Elliott, Jared Brooks as well. And I think that maybe scared Moreno, because Moreno for me is a good grappler. Very underrated in terms of the ground. And he didn't want anything to do with Figueiredo. And that could maybe have been a reason for that he was scared of the guillotine. I think he's maybe vulnerable to leg kicks. He's not comfortable on the back foot. We saw Brandon Moreno exploit that. I think with Figueiredo, I think there was a lot of people that maybe got a bit too carried away with how good he was after what he did against Alex Perez and Joe Benavidez. And I think in a strange way, the performance against Moreno was maybe the wake-up call to people to say, hey, yes, this guy's good, but he's not the saviour of the flyweight division, if you know what I mean. I mean, he's a good fighter, obviously he's the champion, but he's not the be-all and end-all.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think Moreno is just tough as nails. Like, I think it's going to bring a better Figueiredo than what we've seen before,
Yes.
because he was able to hang in there 5 rounds, after a tough, back-to-back almost weight cut. Figueiredo is just like an athletic freak. I mean, he can get away with anything, like you said. I mean, his defense is almost non-existent sometimes. He gets in weird stances. I mean, he is very susceptible to leg kicks because he does put his front leg out so far. On the back foot, he doesn't really pay much attention to defense as well, but he gets away with it, and he finds a way. I mean, he's a very, very, very exciting fighter, and I'm very excited to have, I've always liked the flyweight division. I'm very excited to have a guy like him in the flyweight division that will bring more eyes and bring more attention. I'm going to go with Figueiredo in this fight. I think the factor that you mentioned at the beginning, I think he's going to come in better conditioned. I think he's going to have most likely an easier, if he does everything right, he's going to come in better conditioned, easier weight cut. I think he's going to carry his power with him longer through the rounds. And I think that, it's really tough to say he's going to get Moreno out of there with how well Moreno's chin held up through 5 rounds, but I'm going to go with Figueiredo.
And that was the big thing that surprised me with Brandon Moreno in that fight, was how good his chin was. Because he ate in those... I'm really struggling with my words here. In those first few rounds, he ate some absolute monster shots and just walked through them. So I think his chin held up well. And do you think we might see Moreno try and implement the grappling a bit more this time around? Because we saw Formiga, the only guy to beat Figueiredo, part of the way he did that was by utilising the wrestling and putting Figueiredo in positions he wasn't comfortable in.
I could definitely see it. Yeah, I don't know if it was because Moreno was scared of his gas tank, it being like a quicker turnaround, and he didn't shoot as much because he knew it was a 5-round fight. But coming into this, I definitely think that's a factor we need to look out for. Both guys, like you said, are great on the ground. I think Figueiredo just is really good at scrambling. He catches a lot of stuff in transitions. He works that guillotine in very, very quick on Perez. So, this is a firefight, whether it's on the feet or on the ground. And I think that this is about as good of a, title fight as you can have on any card. And so I'm super, super excited for this one.
It's definitely a worthy co-main, in my opinion. Because the flyweights, they have had issues with trying to draw in the casual viewers because of their size. But when you put them in this position, you've got a high-profile main event and you've got this on the undercard to attract more people to the division. It's a fantastic place, in my opinion. And considering where the flyweight division was, so like Paul Cejudo, he retired, he gave up the belt. People were saying that the division's going to get closed. To see it now getting the sort of appeal that it is, and people recognizing, hey, these guys are very good, I think deserves so much praise. So it's a good job to people like Figueiredo, Moreno, Pantoja, Askarov, this sort of new generation of flyweights. They're the ones that saved the division. Cejudo didn't do it by beating Mighty Mouse. It's these guys.
I agree. All of those people, Roy Val, there's so many different, interesting styles, and contenders coming up in this division. And you have a fun champion who can finish it anywhere. So, yeah. Who are you picking? Who are you leaning towards?
I'm going to lean towards Figueiredo. My heart would love Brandon Moreno to win this fight, because I like the guy on a personal level. I think it'll be good to have a Mexican champion. The guy was cut from the UFC. When they were doing that cult of the flyweight, he was actually out the company. So for him to now come back and then win the belt again, I think that would be a good story. But logic and my brain says Figueiredo is going to be much better this time around because of those extra months to recuperate. And I think he's going to get him out there in 2 rounds.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna stick with a 5-round decision, but I got Figueiredo. I could see him, taking a three rounds to 2, 5-round decision.
Time for us to talk about our main event of the evening, and the middleweight title is on the line for this one. Israel Adesanya defends up against Marvin Vettori. So we're going to go back a couple of years' time, and we're going to go to the same place, Glendale, Arizona. It was fight night, Poirier versus Gaethje. This was the second fight on the main card. Adesanya had just come off his win over Rob Wilkinson. He took on Marvin Vettori, both guys unranked at this point. Adesanya wins this fight by split decision. Nobody really thinks much about the fight at that point. Adesanya goes on to become middleweight champion. Marvin Vettori hasn't lost since. The UFC give themselves an opportunity and say, let's run this fight back.
Yes. Yeah. So, caught each other fairly early in both of their careers. There's a little bit of controversy around their first fight. There's some people who thought it could have been scored closer than what it was. Adesanya had 2 active first rounds, and then I believe in the third, Vettori was able to take him down and get a little bit of top control. Vettori's had some good wins against Jack Hermanson, who took a win not too long ago. And then, he had that most recent, that Kevin Holland short notice fill-in fight that he got the win in as well. Adesanya coming back into his division after that loss to Jan Blachowicz. It's an interesting matchup. I think I was very interested that they went with this one. How about you?
I can understand the UFC's logic in making this fight. All indications that I've heard, and don't take this as gospel, this is just the rumor mill, was that Adesanya wants to fight two more times this year. So he wanted to fight in June, and then he wanted to fight again around sort of September time. They gave it to Robert Whittaker, and Whittaker said, no, I've just fought Kelvin Gastelum a couple of weeks ago. There's no way that I can do June. So they went to the next guy down the line, which is Marvin Vettori. All indications are Whittaker will fight the winner of this fight. It could possibly, depending on the way things open up, that could take place in Australia again. So I think that's what maybe the UFC are looking at. As much as I think the first fight was a factor, and it was a close fight, but I personally thought Adesanya won that one. I think it's more a victim of circumstance. I think Vettori's getting this fight through being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in Whittaker's post-fight interview after the Gastelum fight, he talked about Vettori, asserting that he should have gotten the title shot and everything, and Whittaker has just a little bit stronger strength of schedule than Vettori. So that definitely makes sense, that Whittaker couldn't make it at this time and Vettori came up. A lot of people are not giving Marvin Vettori much of a chance in this, but I don't know. It's tough to say. I mean, Adesanya's coming off of a loss, albeit at a higher weight class where he was able to be taken down. He was taken down in his first fight against Vettori, and I think Vettori's wrestling's only gotten better. Although, I mean, Vettori was rocked in the Holland fight. Holland has at least a somewhat similar striking style as what Adesanya has. And, I think it's a good fight for Adesanya to get back on his feet. I'm not that high. I mean, Vettori, I think, is a really, really good, top 5, if not top 10 middleweight fighter. Who are you leaning towards on this? How do you see this fight going?
I'm going to lean towards Adesanya. I think that Marvin Vettori, as you mentioned before, has got better, but I don't think he's got exceptionally better to get the better of Adesanya when it comes to the striking exchanges. I thought what we saw from Marvin Vettori in terms of his grappling in the first fight, he still fights pretty much the same way. A lot of his takedowns are based on clinching up against the fence and then utilize those trips. And we saw in that first fight that there was about 5 or 6 times he had Adesanya up against the fence, tried to go for the trips, and Izzy just brushed them off so easy. The best way to get the better of Adesanya when it comes to the ground game is to do what Jan did, which is to get those takedowns, shoot those double legs in the center of the ring where Izzy can't use the fence to get back up. If Vettori's able to do that, he's got a chance, but Marvin doesn't normally fight and get those takedowns in that way.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think Blachowicz's success all came from those blast doubles and the reactive takedowns off of Adesanya's shots. Israel is so good in the clinch. He's criminally underrated when it comes to the clinch. I mean, he's really good at distance striking, but I mean, his clinch work is really, really good. Vettori is as well, but I just think that, Vettori will be looking for the takedown, and I think Adesanya will be a step ahead of him in the clinches, in the striking, as well as defending takedowns. I mean, I haven't seen Vettori shoot too many reactive double legs. Like you said, most of his entrances into takedowns are typically, off, chaining off the cage. So, yeah. And then on the feet, I think he's just a little bit overmatched. He was pretty 50-50 with Hermanson. I mean, that was a pretty great win for him. But I mean, they still took rounds off of each other as far as the striking goes. And, I just think that Adesanya is a step above most, if not all, in the middleweight division when it comes to striking.
And it's not as if Vettori has that sort of game-changing power. Like a lot of people, like even John, when I discussed with him on 253, he put forward the idea of Costa with that sort of game-changing power to cause Adesanya problems. Vettori doesn't even have that. It's more sort of a persistent sort of pressure style of striking. It's brawling basically, and
yeah,
you're asking Vettori to brawl against this world champion kickboxer.
Yeah, it's a war of attrition for Vettori. I mean, he definitely wants to wear you down. Yeah, I've never really seen him, rock too many people on the feet or just have like an all-out knockout. Most of his wins are by decision. He has some submission wins as well. Some TKOs from people just kind of getting trapped and like not able to get out from, under him. So yeah, I agree. I mean, I just think Israel has a lot more tools to get it done. I mean, I could see Vettori maybe stealing a round. I could see him maybe, getting a takedown, ending on some top control. And if Adesanya's output is not as good that round, Vettori could take a round. But I just don't really see any way that Vettori could get a finish here, apart from maybe, a submission. But I mean, Adesanya's been pretty good on the ground, with guys his size. And then I don't see him knocking Adesanya out, in any way. Like you said, he's more of a brawler. He really needs to be in close to do much damage, and I don't think Adesanya is going to let him.
I think there's two big factors which could play against Adesanya. Number one, how is he going to handle the loss against Jan Blachowicz? We have seen a lot of fighters in the past where they can maybe go on these long winning streaks, and once they lose a fight, they never gain that sort of confidence in themselves, which could potentially happen to Adesanya. But also as well, Marvin Vettori cuts a ton of weight to get down to 185. Like, I think they both fought in California, and Adesanya only cuts something like about 10 pounds to get down to that weight. With Vettori, he was about 210 to get down to 185.
I mean, Sonya knew, the size of Blachowicz eventually, did overwhelm him at some point. But I think Vettori is still undersized for Blachowicz. And I think, looking at Adesanya's sometimes lower output fights, I mean, I don't think Costa has that much power. I mean, he doesn't have too many knockouts just straight off, a hook or something. He throws a ton of body shots. But when Adesanya is a little bit more worried about what's coming back at him, whether it's Romero or Blachowicz, just by sheer size, his output is a little bit slowed. I don't think he's going to be worried at all about getting clipped by Vettori. Vettori trains at King's MMA. He has a good Cordero style striking, but I don't think that. I think him not being worried about what's coming along the other side, he'll be able to maintain range, and Vettori won't be able to use any benefit that his size might have given him.
Italy's always had a great history when it comes to kickboxers. You look at people like Petrosian. They never had that big Italian star. I can only really count on my hand the amount of Italian fighters in the UFC. Would a Marvin Vettori win help Italian MMA? What would it do for that culture to see one of their own become champion?
I think it would. Yeah. I mean, Alessio Sakara, De Chirico. Yeah. I mean, they've definitely had fighters in the past who have at least made splashes in their respective weight divisions. But yeah, I definitely think it would continue to put Italian MMA on the map a little bit more than what it is, before. I think Vettori would definitely make the most of this with a win. I think he cuts a pretty good promo. He's a funny guy. And I don't think anyone's really expecting him to win this. I think casual fans think that this is a foregone conclusion that Adesanya is going to win, and most hardcores are typically leaning towards Adesanya in this. So I think that, with a win, Vettori would not only put Italian MMA on the map, I think he would shock a lot of people.
Just looking at the opinion polls here, 81% of people are favouring Adesanya to win this one. So you can get Vettori 19%.
Interesting. I mean, it is tough too. I mean, I feel like I want to give Vettori his due. I mean, the Kevin Holland fight, that Kevin Holland was a late fight replacement. So I mean, anytime you have, a replacement like that, you might not have been able to do everything that you wanted to do previously. So, I mean, it's tough to say where Vettori's at. I mean, the Hermanson fight, he looked great in that, and that was a war. But I mean, I would just see Adesanya putting away Hermanson a little bit quicker than what, Vettori did at a 5-round decision, although they have different games. So I'm still leaning towards Adesanya. I see Adesanya by maybe a second or a third round TKO.
I'm going to lean towards third round. Adesanya usually likes to use the first round to gauge his opponents, understand whereabouts their reach is, and then he really comes into his own around the second round. So he did the same thing against Costa. He used the first round to try and gauge whereabouts Costa likes to throw, and then in that second round teed off on him. So I think we're going to see a very similar sort of fight from Izzy. And then again, it's going to be interesting to see how Adesanya does handle this, bearing in mind what happened against Blachowicz. There's enough in this fight for me to be interested in. I just don't think it's going to be as competitive as the UFC would like.
I agree. And like you said, I mean, I think it's a way for Israel to get a win, and to be back on starting a new win streak, and then he gets the rematch against Whitaker. He just wants to get this loss out of his system, and that's understandable. He fought still in the pandemic with no crowd. He gets to come back with a crowd. He's a guy who I think really feeds off crowd energy. He does his dance when he comes out. I think that this is just a good way to get him in a better headspace.
And on that note, we're going to be ending the preview show. UFC 263, on the whole, as they have done throughout this sort of new era, as it were, UFC pay-per-views knocking it out the park. So I think the fans in Glendale, they're going to get a belter. Bit of British slang there.
Yeah, I think that this is, Glendale really, really got a good one. I thought I had a good one in Houston, and man, Glendale's getting about as good of a card as you can get.
I would argue that, personally, and I know no offense to you because obviously you were at Houston, this is the better card in my opinion.
Oh, yeah, this blows 262 away. I think that this is stacked from the top to the bottom, and there are a lot of, a fight like Dawadu, Ivolev, just really, really highly skilled people from, the early prelims to the main card. So.
And then 1 month later, we'll get to do it all again. Vegas has a certain Irishman fighting a certain Louisianan.
Exactly. Another great pay-per-view card.
And we don't know what's going to be happening with John, but if John's not available, would you be happy to talk about that one?
Yeah, I would love to step in.
And we'll be back in a month's time where we'll talk about UFC 264. For now, though, we've been finishing talking about UFC 263. Before we go, a little bit of spring cleaning. Please like, share, subscribe, ring the bell so you never miss a video. It does the algorithm the world of good. And please follow us on our main channel, which is youtube.com/It's Not Cagefighting. Please subscribe to the Patreon as well, so all the money that you donate to us goes back into the channel. As mentioned before, in a month's time, we'll talk about UFC 264, Poirier vs. McGregor. That's been UFC 263, though. A lot of numbers here. That's been Luke Alexander. I've been Karl Bainbridge. Thank you very much for joining me, Luke.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me, Karl.
And I'll let you get on with your day. This is the INC. Thank you for watching.